Bonjour. I promise to be upbeat and positive, and to speak a little bit about design process expectations. And let's see, how does this work? Amongst us as designers and clients and the general public, we have a reasonable expectation that a design process will be somewhat linear, maybe somewhat rational, and proceed in an orderly fashion, but that is often not the case. So typically you would expect that a project would proceed through programming, into master planning, maybe concept design, into more of a master plan and into working drawings and ultimately into a constructed project, and everyone's expectations would be met and everyone would be happy. That's not what I will be speaking of today. These will be 3 projects that are considerably not linear. They veered off into perhaps surprising, perhaps frustrating design processes that were not foreseen at the outset. But that adds to their complexity, makes them richer projects, and ultimately it makes them of their place. So the 3 projects that I will speak of today, they are focused on 3 landscape topics, forks, rapids, and batture. You would say batture, perhaps. Louisiana, batture. And the first one I will start with is the Trinity River Promenade in Fort Worth, Texas. Just a little bit of background, it started out as a fort on a bluff above a river. And through the course of the last 200 years, not much has happened below the bluffs, primarily because it floods quite considerably. So whereas Fort Worth has grown into being arguably a first-tier city, a very large metropolis, immediately below Fort Worth, there is nothing but you could argue, underdeveloped, underutilized land, industrial land. And this is a current photograph showing to the left is below the bluff. It's subject to flooding to this day, despite the levees and the various infrastructures to protect it. So the Trinity River Water District, our client located here, they've spent the last 20 years trying to hatch a plan to develop all of this property. And their strategy is to move the river, to change the course of the Trinity River to cut across. This is a different view showing, you can see the difference between what is developed and what is not. So they will move the course of the river and they will create essentially a protected lake around which they will develop this intensely new district, 2 new districts in fact, anticipating 14,000 new people would be able to move into this district. So by the time that our office was hired to participate in this, they had already put out to bid the construction of 3 bridges that they would build in the dry before the river gets moved. So already, this thing has been in the works for quite a while, and it's moving forward, and the landscape architect brought on 20 years after the concept has started moving forward. So fundamentally, it's about moving the fork, which is highlighted here, and essentially creating 3 forks in the river. Now, historically, the green represented here shows landscapes, different components of the landscape as it exists today. And you can begin to see, just eyeball test, that there's actually less landscape projected into the future. So right off the bat, it's our strategy to figure out how to bring more landscape into something rather than taking more landscape away from the citizens of Fort Worth. So flooding remains a big issue for this river, and to the right you can see the darker gray representing the floodwaters, and to the left representing the areas that would be protected with the light blue. Oops, sorry. So rather than hire a landscape architect, the Water District went out and advertised and interviewed architects only. And we were on an architect team with Randall Stout Associates. They're LA-based, Los Angeles-based architect. And we had worked with them in in Chattanooga, where they had done some museum work, and our office was responsible for the riverfront. So our strategy was actually to reconstitute the team, and Hargreaves became the prime, and Randall Stout, as the architect, would focus on the bridges and the floodgates, and the whole rationale for that was that this architecture needed to function as flood control structures to slow the water down. So the architecture began to develop its own language, and they kind of went on their architect way, and Hargreaves then was able to focus more on the landscape. And the situation here is that half of the river is a soft, it's a vegetated levee, and the other half is projected in this new 400-acre development to be a hard edge. And they had spent the last decade working through strategies for guidelines and prescriptions for just how everything should be. But the more you look at it, the more we dove into it, we realized that it was less about a landscape and it was more of an engineering approach to that. And so our charge was how to redevelop that into a positive public landscape. But so much of it was characterized and driven by engineering requirements related to maintenance vehicles to maintain and access and take care of these facilities, and also the prohibition against planting trees on a levee and the perception that the roots would undermine and cause the levees to fail. And given that flood control is the be-all, end-all of protecting the city, that's a pretty high hurdle to change perceptions on. Another interesting component to this was even the topic of wetlands of any sort caused the engineers and even the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, to kind of lose their mind. The suggestion that anyone would plant any sort of habitat that birds could live in just caused people to be very unhappy. So that you can begin to detect that it's quite difficult to suggest that you can create a public landscape if you have severe restrictions on trees and on wetlands or anything that might constitute positive habitat. And then certainly the gymnastics of trying to get people from above down into the floodway and to make it a habitable, positive space. So when we first arrived on the project, the flood wall itself had essentially 4 acres of exposed concrete, which seemed to us to be an enormous amount of concrete to try to mitigate and try to transform. Our overall strategy for this was to look regionally and then to look locally about how Fort Worth stacks up against comparable cities in terms of the quantity and the quality of the open spaces that the city already has. And it falls well below quantitatively, as well as it falls short quantitatively of the amount of open space it has per person. So when you put that toward a projected new 14,000 residents, suddenly they're deficient. So our charge was trying to figure out strategies for adding more parks, more landscape into this new district. So the master plan showed these over here they're hot yellow projected parks. And our strategy was trying to figure out how we could pull back and reduce development or densify development by stacking it so that we could create more public spaces for this new uptown district. And by that I mean with a master plan showing very tall structures at the prow and the bow of each end of the development, our strategy was to pull that back and to create public spaces as a catalyst to attract and make more valuable those private developments as they occurred over time. So in effect, our strategy is to design and build the public landscapes first as a means to attract public investment. And our mechanism for winning that battle was to do a compare and contrast of the existing conditions or the master plan proposed conditions for the uptown district, and then compare it to benchmark cities around the world in terms of the number of parks within a certain distance, as well as the percentage of open space relative to the larger area. So at this point, we've migrated from pure concept into schematic design and are going through the process of programming to figure out a diverse mix of uses that could be distributed along this 1.5 miles. And as we move forward, we're starting to move into schematic design, and we'll take this one further. The Army Corps of Engineers, who is the agency that controls this project and is funding it through federal dollars, they've allocated $50 million to do public landscape improvements, and our client has added on another $31 million on top of that for this large project. However, the master plan, or the evolving schematic design plan, actually costs about $65 million. So it will be quite a gymnastic event to try to come up with that additional $35 million. I want to move forward into the second project, the Rapids, at the James River Riverfront in Richmond, Virginia, which is a capital city in Virginia. It was also the capital of the Confederacy during the American Civil War. And they made the decision, when that didn't work out so good, to burn the city. So a good deal of that historic infrastructure, the urban fabric, went away. But a lot of those components, bridges, dams, levees, structures that cross the river are still in existence today as non-functional artifacts. And through the 18th and 19th century, the riverfront was largely industrial and had dramatic pollution problems. But as suburbanization and changes in technology evolved, a lot of that industry moved off the riverfront. Everybody let the riverfront be, and the city essentially turned its back on the river since the 1960s. So it's had some 20 years to percolate and to rebound on its own with no federal, no state intervention. It was kind of managed, it was ignored, but it wasn't actively managed. It was also the site of a good deal of tobacco warehousing. That a lot of those warehouses exist today, and they've been converted into residential developments, which is great because it's bringing people down to the river and it's providing a constituency for making positive improvements to the riverfront. There are other complexities to the Richmond riverfront in that it's also subject to severe floods. So in the 90s, they built these large flood walls. And it's fantastic that they were able to incorporate a public walkway along the top, yet you can begin to see that that doesn't necessarily mean it's accessible to a good deal of the population. So that's something to wrestle with. In 2009, they authored a downtown master plan for the entire downtown, and as part of that process, they identified that the riverfront needed its own master plan focused on the landscape, and that's where we came into our engagement at the city of Richmond. And we began our tour of the city by taking a whitewater rafting trip. It's the only city in the world that we know of that has a Class 4 rapids right through the heart of downtown, which makes it quite startling. And in fact, last year it was named the best river town in America ever. Okay. But the great challenge for the Richmond riverfront is it's very difficult to get to the river, to see the river. The flood wall works against that. The access trails are very difficult to navigate. Quite a few of them are single tracks that are appropriate for mountain bikes and maybe the very able-bodied, but it is very difficult for anyone with a stroller or anyone of a certain age that might have difficulty navigating through a very rocky and industrial artifact-strewn landscape. On the plus side, the mayor was very actively involved and was successful in bringing the 2015 World Cycling Championships. So that begins to give a good indication that the administration is actually engaged and thinking positively about how to make improvements to the riverfront, despite the fact that there's very little money for maintenance and for trash pickup, and these kind of quirky, odd warnings about how dangerous it is to move through the riverfront. So coming from the mayor on down, it was about how to access the water sheet itself, not just to look at it visually, but how to engage with it, to touch it, get out onto it. And the contradiction here is the organization that takes care of the water sheet is adamantly opposed to anybody going anywhere onto the water or touching the water because they're afraid people will die instantly. So, you know, you have these dual priorities that conflict quite strongly. It's important with any of these riverfront plans to look at development and landscape as intertwined together. And talking about the public process, it was so important to work with the stakeholders, the landowners, the private developers who own property, as well as to talk to those who are very focused on conservation and the no change, let it be, let the trees take over, just let everything go its own way. So our role as facilitators was to try to figure out and imagine these different futures where it could be 100% development, which certainly polarizes the discussion, or you could do nothing and let it go and further erode and really not make the most of that great resource that's out there. So very quickly, through a series of public workshops, we did reach a consensus that it would have to be a hybrid of sorts that would localize and focus where development could happen over the next 10 years, as well as look for strategic opportunities to make connections, positive landscape connections from the downtown down to the riverfront, not just to the river, but along the river. This diagram begins to show purple for those connections that do not exist today. The white ones exist, the purple do not, and certainly the connections back to the different neighborhoods do not exist. It's a pretty hostile, vehicle-dominant landscape. So a couple before and afters of our strategy, and I don't know if you have this here, but Virginia is one of the few states where it is legal to have rails with trails as opposed to rails to trails, meaning you can have pathways that parallel a rail line without a barrier, with the rationale being that it's much more desirable for kids, adults, families to walk along a pathway that has an even surface to it than it is to walk along the railroad tracks. But you don't need a fence to tell you or to enforce that kind of logic. So they're kind of forward for Americans in thinking that people will use their common sense and not get struck by a train. But if you put the fence up, people will inevitably say, oh, I want to walk down where the train is. So yeah, you can't make sense of it. So this is the missing link, and this is, you would think this would be the easiest thing to do. And I spent a good deal of time talking to the railroad, and they were very happy to talk to me until I brought this topic up, and then suddenly we no longer had phone conversations anymore because they were, while it may be legal, that doesn't necessarily mean they want to play along, given that it's their property. But it did begin to stoke the imagination of how you could spend very few dollars to achieve an enormous amount on something as small as a quarter-mile length of asphalt. On the south side of the river, there's a large train yard here with a mainline train track that comes through. And our strategy was to say, okay, let's keep the train active, which is mandatory. Nobody argues with that. But they don't use this whole train yard, so our strategy was to say, fine, let's fill it up with soil to the top of the flood wall. So if that's the existing condition today, with an unused siding this way, so we would fill it up to the top, and so that somewhat inaccessible top of flood wall becomes the promenade along the edge, overlooking just a fantastic series of rapids moving through the city. And it becomes essentially a front yard to looking at downtown across. But then you're left with this kind of barren riprap armoring. And as the engineers began to talk about how they needed to build a road through there, we said, fine, you can build a road, but you're going to build it as a landscape that allows people to circulate along that road and use it recreationally as opposed to strictly functionally. On the flip side of the river is Browns Island, which again is controlled by a nonprofit agency whose really sole focus is to host a folk festival, a music festival once a year. But other than that, they like to keep the landscape completely grass, just no improvements, no program, nothing. So it was our role to try to figure out how to bring other uses, other activities, to get people there 7 days a week instead of just 1 week a year. And again, how to get people down onto the water. This is a canal, it's protected. It strikes us as a perfect opportunity to get those unfamiliar with rushing rapids, allow them to develop their skills in how to maneuver watercraft in a controlled environment. So if that's the canal existing today and this sort of barren landscape up here, we were looking for strategies to enliven the space and to provide opportunities for people to get off of the island down into the canal and to navigate back and forth on the canal. Immediately adjacent to this is its very large CSX railway trestle that runs the entire length of the riverfront, basically cutting off downtown from the water itself. However, it's used on a daily basis by the college kids who come down there and treat it as an impromptu beach where they, perhaps not very safely, jump off this trestle into the water and swing back and forth on it. But they also get up on some of these industrial artifacts in the middle of the river. This is 3/4 of a mile long. It's not connected at either end, so they swim out to this and walk back and forth and then dive off of it. Yeah. So this goes hand in hand with the missing link trail, which I showed the rails with trails. That happens on the back side, the far side. But we realized that the key thing about connecting both sides of the river, it's the same city, both sides of the river, is to reuse and adapt this infrastructure into a positive pedestrian landscape that would allow people in bikes and wheelchairs to move from one side to the other without having to fight with the automobiles. The other part of Browns Island that proves difficult is that it's so overgrown with vegetation that it needs some severe editing, and there are these rare windows where you can see down from the island into the river corridor, which is just fantastic, and it made us realize that if there is a way to get people under this trestle in a controlled way, in an accessible way, so that they could be in a proximity immediately adjacent to where these rivers are, where all the kayaks and all the rafters and all the stand-up boards go zipping by at high velocity, that this would be the way to go ahead. Then talking about some more urban infrastructure, the pipeline walk is this fascinating structure underneath the railroad trestle, which is so this is a concrete encased pipe, a sewer pipe. And only the most individuals that have a sense of adventure go down there. I was amazed how many people had never been here. And our strategy was to reconfigure this, maybe put a cap on top of it so that it became an accessible, literally a regulatory approved, compliant, accessible route, but yet it could also handle the annual floods that are 10 feet deep of water and just scraping everything away from it. So it had to be a very controlled intervention that would allow it to encourage the public to use it, but not have to have it become some sort of maintenance problem over the long term. Similarly, this sewer pipe becomes a freestanding iron pipe that then moves through space, but it was too narrow ever to get wheelchairs or to get more than one person just barely able to slide by another person. So our attitude toward this was to simply add more grading on top of the existing grate and widen it out so that it would be a compliant, accessible route. And then I will jump to Mayo's Island, which is this great island in the middle. However, it's this industrial recycling center today, primarily because it has no sewer connection whatsoever, and it's in the floodplain. So as much as people would like to develop it as great high-end luxury residential, that becomes quite a difficult challenge. So we looked at interim strategies for using it for laydown for the 2015 cycling events. But we also looked to the future about how you could take some of these industrial recycling components off of the island and turn it into more of an exploratory landscape that could handle the severe floods. And it might be an art park, it might be just a festival space, it might be a larger venue for the folk festival as well. But we realized anything that got sculpted, anything that was to be configured here had to be of such a scale and of such resiliency that it could handle those annual floods. But the owner, of course, has a competing vision of doing 10, 12-story structures. However, that means they would have to build a new bridge higher than the flood wall to get emergency vehicles over it. They have no sanitary sewer, so it was part of our discovery process and also trying to help the city understand that no amount of public investment would ever allow this to happen, because you simply cannot make the sanitary work and you simply cannot make the regulatory requirements for egress and health safety work. But even though that seems like a rational argument, you'd be surprised. The owner was unwilling to budge, and so at least the mayor came out and said, this shall be a park. We will never approve any building permits. So, that showed positive change in a way that the preceding 2009 downtown plan did not. They had a strategy by where they said it could be a park, it could be a development. Everybody wins, which really nobody wins when you take that kind of strategy for it. A little bit further down is Chapel Island, which is entirely a underground detention chamber. You could put a dirigible underground. It's this huge vault with a roof that's flush to the top of the island itself. And the Public Works Department had said, thou shalt never bring the public through here. It's too dangerous. It's just, it's a non-starter. But as we began to show them ideas for how you could fence that structure off, perhaps put a green roof on it, and still allow the people to get along the facility and cut and edit some of the existing vegetation away so that people could have access to an entire 1.5 miles of riverfront that they currently cannot get to today. The Public Works actually became a great partner and collaborator to say, yes, we believe this is something that we could embrace, and this has become one of their first projects going forward. A little bit further downriver at Echo Harbor, which is here. A very big point of contention for the city of Richmond, because the neighbors up on the hill like to believe that they are looking downriver in a view that existed a couple hundred years ago. So this drawing would come up again and again, and it is quite inspiring because the view is quite nice. Sorry. However, the developer who owns the property in the riverfront has the ability to build a mass as big as what is shown in the yellow envelope there. So there's this great tension between, I own it, but it's in a floodplain, but I want to build it, and the neighbors up on the hill who hate it, and they want to keep the view forever. So the previous plan said, you can have it both ways. It can be a building, it can be a landscape. Nobody has to decide, everybody's happy, and so there's no progress. Understood. One more project in Richmond is the final link of a 70-mile bike trail connecting the Williamsburg capital to Richmond. And this is a part of industrial waterfront taking away railroad and cement uses and transforming them into terraces overlooking the river itself. So the priority 1 projects that the city is about to embark on total approximately $35 million, and they're all incremental. They're all connective little bits. This is not a one-size-fits-all. This is not a big concept that rewrites all of downtown Richmond or all of the riverfront in Richmond. It's just incremental surgical insertions into the riverfront. And then priority 2, a little bit cheaper, but again, surgical insertions that allow the city to make those changes incrementally and do it over time, over a longer time frame. So for Richmond, it's a mix of development. It's a mix of connections. Okay, for the final project, the Betcher, it's the New Orleans Riverfront, and This begins to show you post-Katrina, the depths of the flooding. And our site here was never touched by the flooding because in effect it is on the highest ground. So this project sits here, whereas sea level is here, and the rest of the city is quite a bit further down below. This project, the Reinventing the Crescent, was a master plan that we worked on in 2007, 2008. And the approach was to look at 6.5 miles of the riverfront and to figure out how the city could redevelop. So the focus was mostly on architecture and how the city could re-engage the riverfront in a way that it really hasn't for the last decades. And part of the issue was that the flood walls, the levees, are so disruptive to getting pedestrians to the waterfront. The master plan also looked at opportunities for parcels where we could insert development, which in this master plan looked like very tall white towers, which made a lot of people very uncomfortable. But ultimately, it was looking at a way to spur an enormous amount of revenue-generating redevelopment along the riverfront. So the price tag for this was approximately $294 million. So we identified these 12 spaces along the riverfront, and as federal dollars became available, we focused in on 2 areas, Piety Wharf and along the Esplanade. And as I pointed out, those white towers were jarring to many people, and perhaps appropriately, given that the neighborhoods were all 2- and 3-story buildings at the most. The outgrowth of this was a design team that had 3 architects and 1 landscape architect, and through the process of the master plan, it became very clear that there was going to be almost no development because each of the sites were so constrained relative to floodplain, railroad tracks, width of lots, the zoning that just did not apply, that essentially it turned on its head and became a landscape project. So as the $30 million became available from the federal government, we focused it in on the Piety Park, the downriver park. And this was the master plan, and our strategy was to say we would like the Batcher, this volunteer band of vegetation between the flood wall and the levee and the river, to be expanded, to be more of a landscape, more wildness, to overcome the infrastructure that had languished there for years. Oops, sorry. So as part of our team, we had Michael Maltzin doing a large connective accessible route from the city across the railroad track and the flood wall into the park itself. And David Auger, who took the Piety Wharf, and his concept was to create a kind of spiritual pavilion with a bridge that went over the flood wall and the railroad tracks. Oops. So the site was a bit odd in that it's a bit of a gerrymandered, odd-shaped site that's on both sides of the flood wall and the railroad track corridor. And you can see the Batcher in its extent here. It was what we hoped to expand on. It started off as 48 acres, but once you subtract out all the active infrastructure, it quickly becomes 20 acres. And we then, through the process of public meetings and workshops and working with the different regulatory agencies, it became, the program got tightened up and the restrictions on the site got a little bit tighter, as I'll begin to show you here. So much of this site was historically wharves that were built out over the river, butt to butt to butt, like those red boxes on the screen, all serviced by railroad tracks. And they would pull up again, the rail cars would pull up to the concrete apron, which still exists today, even though all of these buildings are gone, except for the Piety Wharf. So this outline, this wall exists today, but nothing else is there. As I said, the Batcher was our starting point for a landscape type because it has this wildness of this great industrial, post-flood, post-fire landscape, which we very much wanted to keep like this and let the vegetation take over and go its own way. And we were completely thwarted in that because the Corps came through and removed all of that. So suddenly you're left with this gravel base where you had this perhaps completely unsafe but really fascinating derelict landscape. So we also had to deal with the perception of safety. This is the Crescent, why New Orleans is called the Crescent City, this great turn in the river. but it's also very much a scary transportation corridor where in 1986 you have a ship come through that runs into a shopping mall and a lot of people get hurt. So, you know, our first meeting with the Corps of Engineers, they showed me a photograph similar to this, and the engineers' question to me was, how do you plan to stop this from happening? And, you know, that kind of gets your attention. Look, we're trying to develop a landscape, not control ships running aground. But it made it very clear that this is not a landscape to be toyed with. You have to respect the power of the river and respect the commerce that goes up and down the river. So in response, I don't want to say that was not a worthy comment. And so we do have a very strong emergency siren system so that when ships are detected coming close to the shore, an alarm will go off. Some of the other complexities and things that kind of triggered concern by the neighbors were, where do you park people? Where all these people want to come and be by the river, so we had to very carefully point out that there are no zoning requirements for parking for parks. But here's what we are up against. You have this long flood wall. You can't see the river. Some of the individuals we met with said, I've never been to the river. And they live in New Orleans. So that's something very powerful as a goal for us to try to figure out how to get people up and over. But another issue that's very hard in getting these parks built is that the cost of repairing these marine structures, as you probably know here in Montreal, is enormously expensive. And in fact, the cost of stabilizing some of these structures caused us to have to edit out components of the park. We also had to wrestle with reuse of some of the wharves for new industrial uses, such as frozen chicken facilities to ship frozen chicken to China, which caused the neighborhood to be up in arms, and rightfully so. It's far better that adjacent to the French Quarter, it becomes more about park and festivals and events than it is about shipping frozen chicken with the kind of skull and crossbones worry there. How much time do I have? 5, 6, 7? The other component, the other really big challenge that we hadn't foreseen at the outset is that a good deal of New Orleans is contaminated soils with very heavy levels of lead, and of course, as luck would have it, that's concentrated right on our project site. So it is not at all appropriate to say that faster, cheaper, lighter, that you can just go into a 20-acre site and just make some tables and chairs and everything will work out fine. You actually have to spend and invest an enormous amount of money and resources to figure out how to stabilize and configure public open space so that it is appropriate for use by children, by dogs, by the neighbors who live next door to this formerly port industrial landscape. So we had to work with soil consultants and environmental consultants to figure out strategies for capping the soil. And our first blush strategy was, well, we believe we can go through and sculpt the landforms and create different rooms and pockets for vegetation. And of course, the Corps of Engineers wants to hear nothing about that. Part of the issue is the river is exceptionally deep at this location, so they're all worried about the landscape falling into the river and being scoured away. So that we had very tight restrictions on where we could add soil. In some cases, no soil was able to be added. In other cases, they didn't care. You could put as much soil as you wanted. However, the hydraulic engineers, they realized that if they allowed us to do what we wanted with soil, then everybody would want that. So they limited us to 12 inches of soil on the site, even though we quantitatively pointed out to them, if you allow us to do concentrated earthworks, we will use less soil. Didn't care. They wanted nothing more than 12 inches. So suddenly, our whole strategy for capping the site and the contaminated soils thrown out the window. So you have the soil stability, hydraulic flow lines, also the restrictions on where trees could be placed or not be placed on the riverfront, which also represents quite a constraint in terms of park making. And we were surprised that they would allow us to plant trees on what they considered the levee, although in Fort Worth and in many other U.S. cities, you cannot plant trees anywhere close to the levee. So it's a bit contradictory. So getting toward the end here, this was somewhat into the design process, showing bands of public pathways that have echoes and they recall the location of railroad tracks as well as the wharf itself. That was a condition of the wharf. And of course, as luck would have it, it would catch fire and pretty much burn. So pretty much 50% of the wharf is no longer existing. So we had to downsize a little bit further, which maybe is not a bad thing because it was expensive to take care of that. And adding further complications, I won't talk about the personalities involved, but the change of mayors. We had never met the first mayor, so it's very hard to shepherd a project through the public process when the mayor is not engaged at all. And then the new mayor is not sure he wants to take ownership of the old mayor's project. So suddenly we have an orphan of a project that's been going on for 6 or 8 years. And then the cost of marine repair means that architect Maltzen, architect Age, they go away. So we're quite fearful that the landscape then is going to start getting cut away as well, yet we were big advocates for keeping as many and as big a trees as we could get. But what's interesting about that is because of the soils, all the trees could not move no matter what you did. The clean soils had to be put in, and there was no ability to say, oh, you can just move the tree over there. It was very constricted in terms of what could go where. In terms of reusing the site and meeting the federal criteria for reuse. Getting to the end. So some of the other complexities, oil-soaked railroad ties as pavements. We expected to find pavement cross-sections that may be this thick. In actuality, the port never removed anything, and they just kept building new pavements of wood, of concrete, of granite, of stone, of gravel, of clamshells, one on top of the other. So suddenly that becomes quite a cross-section of chaos. Fascinating that whole huge swaths of the site were covered in clamshells, which doesn't necessarily make a great growing environment for trees and vegetation. So I'll give you some of the photographs of how the site was assembled, basically putting down control fabric over the contaminated soils, beginning to add new clean fill on top of that, and then finding out halfway through that the other guys in the Corps think, oh, you know what? You can add 24 inches of soil, we don't care. So, okay. So that changes everything, and that means everything has to go up because it's cheaper than hauling off all the contaminated soils to make them go away. So that's the process, showing the contrast between clean soils and clamshells, and then transitioning into the placement of the arcing benches, recalling the railroad tracks. And just in the last 2 weeks, the installation of trees and the pathways, and you begin to see the accumulation of all these trees and taking what has been quite a derelict and desolate environment for the past 25, 30 years and turning it into a place that is going to have an enormous amount of diversity in terms of its plant life. And it'll just be a much cooler environment and allow the public to get into that space as it goes. However, back to the Bachelor, this thing is going on its own way, on its own timeline, and it is taking over, and that's fantastic. And though we were told, no, you cannot assist it, it doesn't need us, and it's going on, and it's quite fantastic. So, to recap, for Trinity River, it was all about catalyzing, creating public landscapes as catalysts for new development, and probing and testing the restrictions that the Corps of Engineers and the city and the developers had about what you can and can't do relative to the landscape. And for the James River, it's all about connective landscapes. It was not about a big park. It was more about surgical insertion and making incremental changes to the landscape to improve the public connection, reconnection to the river. And for New Orleans, it was all about how we as a design team and as an owner group could be adaptable to these ever-changing conditions of both regulatory as well as environmental changes that we were faced with, that we had no indication that a lot of these things would come up as hurdles, and yet we were able to adapt to those, and hopefully in the next couple months that will turn into quite a positive public landscape. Thank you.
Work you have there for us, and now we have a few microphones in the audience. Il y a quelques microphones dans l'audience pour des questions. J'en ai un aussi. Il va y en avoir un en arrière. Est-ce qu'il y a des questions qui proviennent de la salle, des élus peut-être? I do have a question for myself. I was wondering, in your presentation, you said that the culture of the city, of the culture of the occupants and the users is very important in your projects. How do you use that as leverage, typically, in a project such as these ones we have just seen?
Well, for instance, in Richmond, there is always it's a southern city. And we are in Cambridge, and that's a northern city, so there's already this tension about what northerner is going to come down and tell us what to do, what do they know about our landscape. But the more we walked the site or rafted the site or explored with the city individuals and some of the stakeholders and pointed out to them some of the great resources that they perhaps are so used to seeing that they take no note of it or they think it's something not worth saving. But we're able to point out to them that no other city has structures or components in this sort of a setting, that it's something to be valued, and they appreciate that. And it's also cost effective because you're reusing structures and armatures that are already in place and celebrating those components as opposed to clearing everything away and starting fresh. And pretty much all of the projects that we have are brownfield sites, or they're reworked sites. They're not greenfields. So it's important to us to try to amplify and kind of accentuate those components that are there.
And I forgot to say it in the presentation earlier, but your firm has a project in Montreal, le complexe environnemental de Saint-Michel, peut-être que vous connaissez, qui est aussi une réalisation de it's also a brownfield project, and we'll be seeing how it develops over the years, because it's until
it sounds like quite a long timeline.
Yeah, it's for 20 years. Est-ce qu'il y a des questions de l'audience? S'il n'y en a pas, ça va nous permettre de rattraper. Ah, oui.
Keep it so we can answer the questions.
Just a question, perhaps to connect the last presentation we heard and the projects, very different projects that you've shown us, much larger scale. But how do you, once the projects are completed, and are there situations where the public doesn't come and use the site? Like, how do you look at all the other influences that will ensure that the project is a success? Because you've spoken mostly about the process of building them, but once they're complete, what has one of those types of landscapes work as a place where people go? And have you found examples where that doesn't happen because of external forces, or perhaps something regarding the design that didn't work?
Most of these projects are in large U.S. cities, and there is often a deficit of public open spaces, yet there's an immediately adjacent residential component. So there's a hunger for these spaces. They don't need to be ball fields or basketball courts or skateboard parks. They don't need to be heavily programmed. They simply need to be a contrast or an antidote to the densely developed fabric of the city. It's the other. In this case, it's a riverfront, other landscape. So though the New Orleans Riverfront is not going to have a lot of program. For instance, the playground got edited away because they could not afford it. But we've already heard from the neighbors that are on the other side of the flood wall that this is going to be fantastic for them because they can't get to the water. So it's these informal uses that maybe it's a low level of visitation to the parks, but it's an important one. And it operates at a solitary scale as well as up to week-long festivals that might happen adjacent to the French Quarter. I don't have any great fear that this is going to be a problem in either Richmond or in New Orleans, just because there's such a great density of people that want to be at the water's edge. I'm not sure that answered your question, but for these parks that are 20 acres or above, it's not a problem. They generate their own new uses. Individuals adapt how they use the riverfront or the waterfront. So.
Merci. Est-ce qu'il y a un commentaire ou follow-up? Non? Alors, si c'était la dernière question, comme je disais, ça va nous permettre de rattraper un peu notre retard. J'aimerais remercier, thank you very much, Mr. Riedel.